Cold Case, an Angelica Dale Mystery by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 14. I could have kicked myself for jumping to a conclusion. Thankfully, at this point in my investigation, it wasn't seriously detrimental, but it was a bad habit to develop. Not only had someone initially survived the fire, but she actually said something. By the time I waited for what the medical examiner's office could give me, I was ready for another cup of coffee and headed back to the house. Upon arriving, I had an envelope waiting for me with my other response from my Freedom of Information inquiry. I sent a quick text to Letty from Vital Statistics in Fillmore to say thanks for pushing my request through, and went back to the office to organize the new information. So far, I couldn't find anything relating to Sasha Johnson's last words, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. I decided my next step would be to try to make contact with Detective Frank Burns. Twin Pines Skilled Nursing Facility looked completely opposite of what I thought a nursing home would look like. The sprawling campus had a main building which looked more like a hospital. It also boasted a property that had several cottages, mostly one or two bedrooms, where people could live out their days or complete physical rehabilitation before returning to their home in the community. Around the cottages, the faded grass, trees, and bushes looked as if they were trimmed with scissors. They were practically designed, and even the handicapped ramps that led up to each one did not detract from their quaintness. I pulled up and parked in front of cottage number 6 and made my way up the ramp. Before I could knock, the door opened. "Miss Dale?" "Yes, Nurse Malloy?" "Yes, call me Nancy. Please come in." She opened the screen to let me in and immediately enveloped me with a smile. "I'm excited you're here," she said genuinely. "Frank is having a good day, and anyone who is willing to speak about cop talk is oh so welcome." I returned her smile. "I'm glad too, but you will tell me if it gets to be too much for him." "Yes, yes, I will let you know if he gets tired. This way." I followed her down a brief hallway into a back room. From his physical features, I could tell at one time Frank Burns was a tall man. Even though he was wasting away, he had big bones and large feet. His eyes were still bright and inquisitive, and he too had a welcoming smile on his face. He had cozy slippers on his feet, fleece pants, a sweatshirt, and a thick throw covering his lap. He slowly lifted his arm and motioned for Angel to come closer. "Hello, hello, you must be the detective." He paused and looked at her with piercing green eyes. "What a pretty girl." I moved forward and very delicately picked up his hand and gave it a little shake. I grinned at him and he winked at me. I laughed. "Thank you. Are you always a bit of a flirt?" He laughed. "Not so much when I was younger, but now I'm old and dying, I can get away with a lot more," he replied honestly. He turned to his nurse. "Nancy, don't be idle, girl. Get us some coffee, will you?" Nancy took his chiding in good humor and turned from the room. "And some of those lemon cakes," he barked after her. He turned his attention to me, his eyes alight with excitement. "So you are looking into the Aspen Club fire. I'm surprised no one did it sooner. You didn't agree with your superiors or the district attorney's office about Stormie Gyles' guilt?" Frank shook his head. "My biggest problem was we didn't have the evidence to arrest her. It was a circumstantial case from the beginning. I thought maybe we should rule out some things before we ran full tilt with a circumstantial case. But to tell you the truth, it was the first time we had a fire with that many victims. It was pretty horrific for this small town." I nodded, understanding. Everyone needed a quick resolution. "Exactly." He coughed a little bit, and as if on cue, Nancy returned with coffee and a plate of the mini lemon cakes. She smiled at them both and set the tray on the coffee table. She was about to serve them when I decided to step in. "Nancy, would you like to take a little break? I can serve us, and as long as you are close by." My voice drifted away. "Well, a cup of coffee and my book on the patio would be nice if you're okay with that, Frank." Yes, yes, a good idea. I should have thought of it myself. You go ahead. He raised one hand in a shooing motion to emphasize his acceptance. Nancy nodded and turned toward the door. Just give me a holler if you need me. I began to serve him coffee and cake. She's a good girl, that one. Frank nodded at the door Nancy just exited with a look of affection in his eyes. She's the next best thing since I don't have family nearby. He looked at his plate with three cakes and nodded approvingly. Smart girl. Everyone usually assumes I don't have an appetite and tries to give me one cake. I laughed and settled back into my chair. The coffee was good and the cakes were out of this world. Were you at the scene in the beginning? Frank took a bite of lemon cake and shook his head. No, I came on a little later when they needed a newbie to do some grunt work. I mainly interviewed family members, schlepped evidence back and forth, and reviewed telephone and bank records. Normally, I had a good idea of the direction my investigation was going, so my questions came naturally. I was at the stage where I needed as much information as I could get to give my investigation traction. Interviewing a former cop was different. Their narrative was intuitive in anticipation of the questions that were to come. Even though Frank was older and sick, I decided to keep my questions to a minimum. At what point do you think things got off track? I asked. Once the investigation determined there was a fight between Stormie Gyles and Derek, everyone got tunnel vision. We didn't even complete backgrounds on the rest of the victims. He looked at me and wiggled an eyebrow, something the defense was quick to point out. I gave him an ironic smile. He wasn't wrong. That bartender had some pretty sketchy friends. As a matter of fact, one of which had a previous arrest for arson. I looked at him, a little wide-eyed. Seriously? Frank nodded his head, and when I told the lead detective, he shrugged and said, I think we got our girl, Burns. Don't waste time on that. That must have been shocking as well as frustrating, Frank agreed. Yeah. He had made a fist with one of his hands and was softly beating the arm of the chair. I stayed silent, allowing the natural sounds of the house to fill in the space. A nautical-style clock ticked loudly on the mantel, and I could hear the muffled bump of the clothes dryer. His face screwed up in agitation. There was also that girl he was supposedly sleeping with. Bailey? I interjected. I don't know her name. She had these deposits on her account, but I never had the opportunity to locate the source. There was a lot of information about her I didn't have time to fill in. Parents, siblings, and work history. The little built-in indicator in the back of my head began sending shivers up my spine. I asked Frank the same question I asked of Stormy. What makes you think there was a relationship? The bank statements. I remember a hotel receipt from Fillmore. Frank tapped his finger on the arm of his chair, trying to recall. It didn't raise any alarm bells until I saw on one of her bank statements transactions from Fillmore. I thought it needed following up. Then we received his pager. There were intimate messages from another number that wasn't Stormy. He paused again, this time tapping his forehead with his finger. What was that girl's name? He said more to himself than to me. He couldn't grasp hold of it and finished his thought. I wanted to trace their activities and interview anyone who could have seen them together, but again, I was told to let it go. Frank was a little excited, his face flushed, and he seemed jumpy. Shall I make us some tea? Normally, I didn't stop a witness during their recollection, but Frank needed a break. He nodded, but motioned for me to stay seated. Nancy always fixes me a small lunch around this time. As if on cue, that dear lady entered with a tray of fruit and tea sandwiches. Ah, my dear, right on time. Thank you. We invited Nancy to join us, but mainly drank our tea and munched in companionable silence. You used to be a cop, Frank stated confidently. My eyebrows rose in surprise. He laughed and nudged Nancy. She acts just like a cop. They both looked at me and smiled. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. He gave me a thoughtful look. Why did you leave the police force? I smiled. That is a story for another time. Simply put, politics. Frank nodded knowingly. You know, I'm not saying the girl was innocent, but we will never know, will we?
That's why you should present a complete case to the prosecutor.
Did that experience change the type of detective you wanted to be? Frank shook his head.
Nope, nope. I figured out which detectives were first rate and which I should avoid, or at least double check the work I assigned to them. I made it to the rank of captain, and all my guys knew I didn't tolerate laziness or shoddy work.
Frank was a proud man, and my guess, a great detective. I think I would have liked working for you, Frank, I said wholeheartedly. Frank looked at me, but then put his head down. I wondered if I had said something wrong, especially when he looked up and his eyes were shining with moisture. Nancy smiled, leaned forward, placed a hand on Frank's arm, and whispered, "That's the best compliment you could have gotten, huh, Frank?" He nodded, pulled a tissue out of a sweater pocket, and wiped his eyes. After he regained his composure, he shoved his tissue back in his pocket and looked at me sharply.
I've got something for you, detective.
He smiled slowly at me. Still holding my gaze, he said to Nancy,
Nancy, go into my closet and bring me that banker's box, the one on the floor. It shouldn't be too heavy for you.
Nancy returned in moments, carrying a long banker's box. She set it on the floor between Frank and me and stood off to the side, waiting. He nodded to me, and I knelt in front of the box and opened the lid. The first thing that caught my eye was a manila file folder with a police file number and the words, "The Aspen Club," typed across the top. My head snapped up, and I caught the naughty grin plastered on his face. "Frank, you didn't." Frank shrugged nonchalantly.
I would go down to the evidence room and take a look at the file every now and then, over the years. When I became captain, they let me keep the case in my office. By the time I retired, the case had timed out. But the order to destroy the evidence never made it to my office, so
"So you just took it with you?" I finished, my voice a little higher than usual.
who cares if I still have evidence from a case that was supposed to be destroyed anyway?
He said frankly. I shook my head in disbelief and returned to the box. There were bags of evidence, each with its contents and the date written in a neat hand on the front. I looked back at Frank and Nancy. Both were smiling at me like two proud parents.
The box is yours. I'd bet my pension if anyone can do anything with it, you can.